great lineup of speakers today, and we hope that you can learn a lot. For those of you that are not familiar with UVIG, UVIG's a member-based nonprofit organization that provides our members with credible information and resources for renewable energy decisions, peer-to-peer networking, knowledge sharing, and professional education experiences. We just finished off our last technical workshop in Nashville, and our next activity will be the spring technical workshop in Tucson, Arizona, and you're all invited to attend. There's really nothing quite else like UVIG anywhere, and if you're new to UVIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us, and we'd like to hear what you have to say. I think you'll really enjoy the event, and we've got a great place that we're hosting it in Tucson in middle March. Before we get started, I want to cover a few logistical matters. First off, you're all muted. That just helps us out with the phone line management a little bit more. We will, though, have plenty of opportunity for question and answer, and what we'd like you to do is please use the question and answer box on the right side of your GoToWebinar display. You can type us some questions during the talk, and if we can, one of the analysts in the room will reply to you on the fly. If not, we'll make sure we save it for the last 15 minutes of presentation. We plan to wrap up promptly at the top of the hour. Okay, so who do we have for panelists today? I'm joined by three of my colleagues here at NREL. We've got Wesley Cole, who works on our Regional Energy Deployment System model, a capacity expansion model for understanding how the power system might transform through the year 2050. Then we've got Jennie Jorgensen, and Jennie Jorgensen is going to talk to us about the role that transmission can play in increasing renewables in the Western Interconnection. And then we'll finally wrap it up with Greg Brinkman, who will talk about some very high penetration level studies, actually probably the highest wind and solar penetrations we've ever looked at, in a follow-on study to our 2012 Renewable Electricity Future Study and Eastern Renewable Generation Integration Study. So we've got a great panel for you guys today, and without much further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Wesley. Go ahead, Wesley.
Great, thanks, Aaron. So yeah, really excited about this group of folks we have here. My purpose here is I represent more of the long-term kind of outlook forecasting type folks at the laboratory, and so I'm going to give the perspective of kind of where the grid is right now and what we see is how it's going to evolve, and then let Jennie and Greg talk more in the details of how things operate in a higher penetration renewable energy future. So this work that I'm presenting is it's all public. We've already published it. It's part of our 2017 standard scenarios work. It's our U.S. electricity sector outlook. So if you're interested in more details, you could pull up the report online and go through. I'm only going to touch a fraction of it today. There's a lot more available. So just to start, to just kind of get us in perspective where we're at. So wind and solar, I think everybody's pretty familiar that they've been growing quite rapidly over recent years. 2016, we had nearly 7% of the grid mix was from variable renewable energy resources. So the growth in renewable energy has been primarily variable renewable energy. And then in addition to this growth in renewable energy, really the only other technology that's been seeing growth over the past dozen or so years has been natural gas technologies. Other technologies haven't really been seeing growth. So it's all been in variable renewable energy and in natural gas. So in terms of starting to make projections for the future and what the future might look like, we always start with cost and performance projections. So that is our companion product to this standard scenarios work, is our annual technology baseline. So here, this obviously using our 2017 version of that. So these are NREL's cost to performance projections for electricity sector generation technologies through the year 2050. And the figure here on the left is showing an example for wind for a TRG4. That's a Techno Resource Group 4. It's for a location with an average wind speed of about 8 meters per second, showing the capacity factor, CapEx, O&M projections out through 2050, and then the resulting LCOE that comes from that. So spent a lot of time developing these projections, benchmarking them against other current reported values from the market, as well as other estimates that are reported out there in the literature, and this forms the basis for making projections out into the future. We also pull things like fossil fuel cost projections from the annual energy outlook, and things like demand growth from there as well, and then roll them into our modeling tools. So we're primarily relying on two models to look out into the future. One is the REEDS model, the Regional Energy Deployment System. So it's looking at the bulk power system side of the electric power sector. Has a lot of spatial resolution. We're explicitly accounting for renewable energy integration constraints, and representing transmission. And then for the distributed side of things, we're using the DGen model or distributed generation model that's looking at a county level resolution, looking at individual customers and how they might or might not adopt specifically distributed PV. And so the combination of these two things, we take all of our annual technology baseline, our cost performance pieces, we run them through our models and create this ensemble of scenarios. And we have a lot of different kinds of scenarios that we look at. So things like differences in load growth, different retirement scenarios, natural gas prices, CO2 policy, climate scenarios, transmission scenarios, storage cost scenarios. So we've got a whole bunch of, I think there was 26 scenarios we looked at, and are really looking across the range because we know that the future is not, a single line. Well, it will eventually become a single line, but it's hard to say what that single line is. So we want to look at a wide range of futures to see what kinds of trends show up consistently across many different scenarios. So as we do that, we get scenarios that look like this. So this scenario is representing our mid case. So this is basically all the default assumptions, showing the generation mix on the right, or on the left, the capacity mix on the right. You could see that in this kind of mid case scenario, there's not a lot of dramatic change really until you get out into the 2040s. There is growth in wind and solar over time, especially on the generation side of things, but it's not there. We're not anticipating any dramatic changes if things just kind of continue as they have. However, if you start looking regionally, you do see some transformations between today's system and the future electricity system. So the upper figure is showing the current grid mix by state in 2016. Technologies are a little bit harder to see, you're kind of small there, but natural gas is the brown and renewable energy is the green. Those are the two biggest ones you're seeing there. Coal, black, and nuclear is the reddish pink color. And then the lower figure is showing this mid-case scenario in 2050. And so you can see a couple different things. One, you see a lot of natural gas and coal in today's mix. You do see some big green or renewable energy pieces in certain states, places like Texas and California and Iowa. And then when you get down into the 2050 system, you can see states that have a lot of renewable energy generation, states that are relying a lot on natural gas, but that the whole system is transforming from today's system to one that's primarily renewable energy and natural gas generation, where 75% of total generation is from renewable energy or natural gas. So that is a pretty substantial change. It's happening over 35 years, so it in some ways isn't dramatic, but in other ways is.
Hey, Wesley, so do we see some states having over 50% renewable energy in that bottom figure? Is that what I'm seeing?
Oh, certainly. You look at Iowa there, and it's well over 50%. It's obviously exporting quite a bit of that energy to other regions. But of its total generation mix, it's definitely exceeding well above 50%. So the other piece we see though is we've just been looking at one scenario here. This is just a snapshot of just one case. There's a lot of different scenarios we're looking at, and as we start to look across those, we can see a variety of different futures. So we have the four kind of primary generation technologies here: renewable energy, natural gas, coal, and nuclear power. With the mid-case line in the dotted blue, the dashed blue line that we've been showing. But then we've also run a whole bunch of other scenarios, and you can see those other scenarios highlighted here in the sensitivity range. And there's definitely a lot of uncertainty, but the consistent trend across these scenarios is that we see renewable energy increasing over time. And there's only a very few cases where it stays flat for a long period of time, and those are typically where we see, cases where renewable energy cost doesn't change from today's prices, or where natural gas prices stay extremely low in the $2 to $3 range for 20 or 30 years. So there's a lot of potential here for renewable energy. The other related piece here that starts to get really interesting too is how the wind and utility scale wind, utility scale solar prices have changed over time and how they're anticipated to change. So here we're showing PPA prices from LBNL from 2008 through today. You could see that the solar and wind PPA prices have been converging. So this is kind of a new thing that's been happening. We now have wind and solar that are roughly the same price now, going out into the future. And so now as we look going out into the future, you could look at how costs might change over time. So here we're showing the PV cost range based on your resource quality and the wind cost range based on your resource quality from now out into the future. And you can see that these ranges overlap pretty considerably, and that once you get out into the 2040 time period, they start to overlap just with the natural gas fuel price. We do the same kind of thing, but now say, well, instead of just looking at kind of a mid-case assumption, let's look at low-cost wind assumptions. We could see wind become a more cost-competitive resource, competitive with gas in the very near term. And then same thing with low PV costs. We could see PV becoming just competitive with just the fuel price for natural gas in the near term. And so this has a lot of promise for renewable energy. So renewable energies wouldn't just be competing against other new resources, but if you're now competing against natural gas fuel prices, you could now compete against existing resources on the grid. And so that gives a whole different dynamic for what could happen with renewable energy deployment out into the future. So next piece I just want to touch on is just specifically the variable renewable energy penetration potential across these scenarios we looked at. So the vertical axis here is showing the VRE, or variable renewable energy penetration, so that's your wind and PV penetration over time across all the scenarios that we ran. And we're going to highlight a few different scenarios. So you can see the total range going anywhere from it's about 18% up to above 50% of variable renewable energy penetration. This is all purely on an economic basis. This isn't policy driven or any other pieces. And you can see one of the largest factors here is what is the relative price of natural gas. High natural gas price scenarios, you get very high penetrations of renewable energy because it's the least cost resource in basically all parts of the country, where low natural gas prices lead to lower end of renewable energy penetration. Same kind of story with renewable energy costs. Low renewable energy costs push renewable energy to become cost competitive over many parts of the U.S., and high renewable energy costs, which we've defined as the 2016 values, don't change over time. We're always at today's renewable energy costs. That limits deployment for renewable energy over time. And then finally, if we just look at wind or PV specifically, instead of, all renewable energy gets cheap or all renewable energy is expensive, just looking at either wind gets cheaper than expected or PV gets cheaper than expected, then you still get pretty high penetrations. Either just a single technology could lead to pretty high penetration renewable energy, up to, on an economic basis, getting above 40% variable renewable energy penetration. So there's a lot more about these scenarios. There's a whole bunch of scenarios we haven't looked at. We've put all of this data online, and it's available for you to go grab. We have a scenario viewer. It's dynamic. You could go in and change things. So here we're showing state-level utility PV capacity. Over time, you could look at other scenarios, compare scenarios with each other, look at different technologies. So this is all available for you. You could download the scenario data, look at it in more detail. We encourage you to go look there. And so I'm just going to close out there and just provide you here with the links to the full report as well as to the viewer itself, where you can get this data. And feel free to follow up with me if you have any questions about any of this material, or if you just see things in there you're really interested in talking more about. I'd be happy to engage with you there.
Yeah, Wesley, while we do the transition to get Jennie all queued up, we had one question from Drake Bartlett. He asked about the coal generation that we saw in your graph, and I think his question was originally about capacity, but you're showing energy. And if we look at that graph, we see a slight increase in generation from coal plants between about 2024 and 2036 or so. Is that attributed to increased utilization, or do you actually anticipate coal capacity getting added in the mid-case?
No, that's a good question. So yeah, we don't see any new capacity additions for coal in any of these scenarios. It's hard to build a new coal plant. They're relatively expensive, but this is essentially the increased generation is from additional utilization from existing coal plants. And mostly given if natural gas prices are assumed to come up slightly in our reference case, if they do come up, then that gives coal a bigger advantage versus natural gas in a 10 years time frame.
Great. Well, I just saw a flurry of additional questions come in, so we're going to try to keep the agenda going and let Jennie start talking. We'll field these questions on the fly if we can while we're sitting here. We'll get Wesley logged into a computer. And Jennie, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Aaron. As you mentioned, I am Jennie Jorgensen. I've been an engineer here at NREL for about the past 5 years. My research focuses on looking at the operations of the electric power grid, particularly under high renewable futures. So today I'm going to be discussing some recent analysis looking at the interaction between transmission and energy storage in a high wind future. And I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors, True Mai and Paul Denholm. So for those of you who haven't heard of the Wind Vision study, this is a report put out by the U.S. Department of Energy in the year 2015, looking at the effect of strong, sustained wind industry growth into the future. And the report showed significant health, environmental, and economic benefits to wind growth in the U.S. The Wind Vision study scenario, which was sort of their core study scenario, looked at a future in which wind serves 35% of U.S. electricity by the year 2050. And for the remainder of the presentation, I'll be focusing on that final year, the 2050, that shows the high wind penetration. So as you can imagine, if the U.S. is going to achieve 35% wind, the regional penetration of wind could be substantially different than that. Particularly in the middle of the U.S., where we have a really good wind resource, but less load than we do on the coast, we see penetration levels upwards of 50% in the Wind Vision study. So as you can imagine, the Wind Vision study found that transmission would be an important part to support increased wind penetration in those regions. So following on to that, we did some work here at NREL looking at the ability of the grid to operate such a high level of wind system. So we did follow-on analysis by creating a Wind Vision-like scenario of the western U.S. I should note the reason why we didn't look at the entire U.S. Like the Wind Vision study did was because with the high level of fidelity we wanted in our modeling the whole U.S. isn't at the moment computationally tractable. NREL is working on that. But in the meantime, we stuck just to the western part of the U.S. As you can see from the map on the left, on the right, wind penetration varies substantially by state with really high wind levels in those Rocky Mountain states of Montana, Wyoming, and New Mexico. So we wanted to analyze the operation of the grid at an hourly level, so we used a unit commitment and economic dispatch model that's publicly available called Plexos. And to use Plexos, we start with a database of the Western Interconnection that incorporates every generating unit within the footprint, details about those generating units, so maximum capacity, heat rate, ramp rate, et cetera, along with the transmission network topology, including expected transmission builds through year 2030. So then we took the levels of wind, solar, and load from the Wind Vision study and aligned our hourly profiles with those levels of wind. And the first thing you can imagine that when we're looking at the network topology of the year 2030, but wind levels from the year 2050, we might have some wind integration issues. So we also analyzed 3 transmission build-out scenarios that are shown on the map, the top maps on the top of this slide. Our first transmission build-out scenario, we added 4 new lines that have actually been proposed for the western U.S. To facilitate with wind energy deployment. And then further add on to those scenarios with our second and third transmission build-outs. And what we saw when we do an annual run of the operation of the power grid, one of the results of interest is annual renewable energy curtailment. So that means renewable energy that is available to be used but can't for various reasons. One of those reasons could be the inability to get load from where it's generated to where it's needed, or it could be an inability to turn down your conventional generator fleet. So there's a lot of things that could drive curtailment, but we found in this case, with our transmission builds, we were able to substantially reduce that curtailment. And in fact, we did a bounding scenario called the copper sheet scenario, where we eliminate all transmission constraints, and what we found was less than 1% annual curtailment. So that really indicates our results that in this case, our curtailment was almost entirely being driven by lack of available transmission. And it's not actually shown on this slide, but another scenario we ran was a case in which we made the conventional generator fleet more flexible it was able to turn down faster and lower, and that only reduced curtailment by 1 percentage point. So again, in this case, curtailment being largely driven by congestion. So while the transmission build-outs from the previous slide that we evaluated in that study might show very favorable economics or seem like kind of no-brainers from the standpoint of integrating wind energy, there are other substantial barriers to building large-scale transmission. Siting, regulating, permitting can all be a real challenge when you're trying to travel potentially thousands of miles with tons of metal. So, and another real issue is evaluating who's going to pay for the line to begin with, and then how do you allocate those benefits once the line starts being used. So, another possible method to combat wind curtailment is energy storage. You can potentially avoid some of those issues that you might have from transmission. So we set out to evaluate whether batteries plus wind would make sense. So our approach was to start with the same 5 transmission scenarios that we've just been discussing, and then add 6 gigawatts of energy storage to each of those scenarios, 2 gigawatts in Montana, 4 gigawatts in Wyoming. These are long-duration batteries that have 8 hours of duration with an 80% round-trip efficiency. And we basically did the same annual simulation for all of those runs. And our first result, this shows the annual renewable curtailment as we've been talking about for each of these runs. Our first result was really that both energy storage and transmission reduce curtailment, but transmission is more effective. So on the y-axis we have renewable curtailment, and on the x-axis we have our 5 transmission scenarios. And what we find is that with the purple color, transmission is very effective at reducing curtailment. Storage is also effective, but especially compared to the base case, it's just not nearly making the same dent that transmission is. The reason for that is that wind has extended periods of curtailment. They last longer than 8 hours. Actually, in our base case, 40% of the curtailment events lasted longer than 8 hours. And I think the longest one was like 330 hours. So storage can charge for the first 8 hours of that event and then has to just sit idly until the end of the event before it can discharge its energy. So that really cuts into the capacity factor for storage and thus how useful it can be for combating curtailment. In addition to that, even if storage could constantly charge and discharge, it has a theoretical maximum capacity of around 40% due to those efficiency losses, whereas your utilization factor of transmission lines could be substantially larger. So our second result is that the value of storage really depends on the availability of transmission. So on this slide, we're talking about the value of the energy value of storage. So the value of the storage device providing arbitrage for an entire year, normalized by capacity, power capacity of the battery on the left, or energy on the right. And what we find is that in the base case, your value of storage is really hindered by the lack of transmission, just as your wind is being hindered by transmission. But as you add transmission capacity, you see an increase in your value of storage. And so transmission can help storage take better advantage of arbitrage opportunities, but that's only true to a point. So in our unconstrained scenario, when there's no curtailment left to avoid, as we saw on the previous slide, there's less or no zero marginal cost energy to arbitrage against, and the value of storage goes down again compared to our 3 transmission build-out scenarios. Our third result is that it matters where storage is located. For this sensitivity, we took that 6 gigawatts of storage and moved it from Montana and Wyoming, where the wind is, to Southern California, where the load is. Southern California, you can think of, they have expensive gas generators that have to turn on to help serve their peaking load. So we wanted to see how storage could impact the system there. And the plot on the left-hand side, we see the same graph that we were looking at on the previous slide. On the right-hand side is when we move that storage to California, and what we find is a slightly lower energy value for storage placed in California, due to the fact even though you can displace high-cost energy in your congested system, your Montana and Wyoming wind isn't effectively serving California load, meaning you can't take advantage of that cheap energy to arbitrage against. And finally, the energy value of storage alone does not seem to be enough to justify the capital cost of storage. So in agreement with previous studies, both here at NREL and other places, there's still just a relatively small value for storage providing arbitrage, and it just can't justify the current capital cost of storage and even some of the most optimistic costs into the future. But it is important to note that we didn't include other important sources of value for storage, including capacity value or the ability to displace conventional generator builds, or the value of providing ancillary services. These additional value streams would also be dependent upon location and transmission availability, just as energy value is, so this would be an important area for future work. So to conclude, we've begun to explore the relationship between wind, transmission, and storage. The relationships between these technologies are complicated, but pretty important. Both energy storage and transmission can help reduce curtailment, although transmission is generally more effective just due to the curtailment patterns of wind in this study. But energy storage and transmission do fall in a virtuous cycle, meaning that they help each other out. The sum of their combined value is greater than the sum of each of the parts. However, that's only true to a point. There's a balancing act between transmission being able to enable storage to provide more value with arbitrage and then completely eliminating the need for it. But again, the energy value we consider here is just a piece of the puzzle. Future analysis should look at the trade-offs between capital cost, capacity value, ancillary service value, et cetera.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Kind of just like last time, we're gonna ask a few questions. We've got a little bit of time in the agenda.
Sure.
The first one I'm going to go with is for Wesley. Wesley, we got a question from Tom Acker in Arizona. In the scenario figures that you showed, it appears that there's a large increase in renewable energy in 2040. Why does that occur?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So one of the figures we showed was the LCOE of wind and solar versus just the natural gas fuel price. And what happens around 2040 is that the wind and solar LCOEs are now competitive with just the natural gas fuel price. So you start seeing a lot more build out of renewable energy starting in 2040 to displace existing units, where before they were just competing against new gas units. Now they're competing against existing gas units, and because they're able to compete against existing units, the growth accelerates.
Great. I've got one more for you, Wesley. You ready for it?
Yeah.
All right. Can you comment on the role, if any, that storage technology assumptions had in your renewable penetration levels?
No, that's a good question. So storage is definitely one of the technology options available in the model. It does get built in our mid-case scenario. There wasn't a lot, on the order of 10 gigawatts of new storage. Some of the other scenarios, a lot more. And it also depends on what you think battery costs are going to be. Some people are very bullish with battery costs, some are less. We ran different cost sensitivities as part of this work, and when we said storage costs are going to come down aggressively, we would get well over 100 gigawatts of battery storage deployed on an economic basis. So a huge piece of that is where storage costs are going to the future, but it definitely has a high potential to be deployed and is a significant value to renewable energy.
Great. Well, we're going to get one more in here, and this one's for Jenny. Then we'll hand it over to Greg. Jenny, what were the limiting factors that really caused the curtailment? Can you remind us of what you zeroed in on?
Sure. Yeah, for the high wind case that we were looking at, the main contributing factor to curtailment was transmission congestion. So that's just the inability to get wind from Montana and Wyoming, the regions where all the wind was located, to places where there's sufficient load to absorb it. In this case, closer to the coast, the western coast. So another factor that did contribute was the conventional generator fleet, which has to, of course, turn down to accommodate wind energy when there's high levels of wind, but sometimes you need to keep generators on because you know that your wind might be ramping down later, or you need to provide reserves. So that also caused a small fraction of the curtailment. But in the scenario we looked at, the real contributor was transmission congestion.
Great, thank you. Drake, Tom, and David, we see your questions on there. We're going to let Greg talk about the REF study, and then we'll save those questions for the end. But please, audience participants, drop those questions in there to the extent that we can. We'll answer them now and save more time for later. Greg, take it away.
Thanks, Aaron. My name's Greg Brinkman. I've been at the lab for almost 10 years now. And over those 10 years, I've worked primarily on operation modeling of high penetration scenarios, high penetration of renewables scenarios, mostly in the U.S., but some internationally. And actually, a lot of the studies I've worked on are some of the bigger studies that we've done, including the Renewable Electricity Future Study, the Western Wind and Solar Integration Study, Phase 2, and a couple. The study I'm going to talk about today is sort of the culmination of a few of those studies, and gets at some of the questions that have been sort of left outstanding in those previous studies. So as background, the Renewable Electricity Future Study analyzed and investigated a really large transformation of the U.S. power system, looking at the map of 2010 power system on the left, the 2050 power system on the right there, in terms of transmission, renewable penetration, and things like that. We looked at major transformation to the grid and penetration scenarios up to and above 80% of renewables. Then another study that we're building off of here, and one of the questions left unanswered from that study is what might happen sub-hourly in higher renewable penetration scenarios, and so that's one of the key questions we're getting at here. The next slide here looks at the Eastern Renewable Generation Integration Study. This study provided a lot of the inputs and the methodology and the types of analysis that we're doing in this study. So we're sort of building off of this study, which looked at up to 35% penetration of renewables, and so we're going substantially beyond that as sort of the definition of high penetration has been changing over the last 5 to 10 years, and we're trying to look at some of these higher penetration scenarios. And then there's one more study that we sort of built off of here to produce the scenarios and analysis in this study, and that's the study that Wesley was just talking about, the 2017 version of the standard scenarios. These scenarios that we're talking about here are not an exact representation of any of the standard scenarios, but we're somewhat crafted based on the highest penetration scenario, the 80% renewable penetration scenario from the 2016 standard scenarios analysis. So we're sort of a blend of those three things to create the scenarios and define some of the questions that we're addressing in this analysis. So this slide shows what the base scenario looks like in this study, and we also looked at a penetration level that was 10% higher than this in terms of wind and solar penetration. So you can see the transmission build-out on the right, the layout of the region, I'm sorry, on the top right, the layout of the regions on the bottom right. The top left shows the penetration of each technology within each of those market footprints or regions. And the key caveat that I'll mention here is that this study is an operational analysis using Plexos, same as what Jennie Jorgensen was talking about. And so we're really looking at the ability to balance the system in terms of generation and load and in terms of power flow. We are not analyzing inertia questions, and we're not analyzing voltage stability questions except at a relatively simplistic level. Aaron, I think you had a question?
Yeah, so just one other caveat. We know that the market region footprints have changed a little bit over time. We know that SPP and MISO don't look exactly like we have them here, but this is what they looked like, and I think 2012 was the year that we based that on.
Thank you, Aaron. So for this scenario, we sort of lump a lot of the baseload generation together because it's uncertain at this point what baseload might look like in the future in terms of coal or nuclear. So in terms of capacity, we retired all the nuclear units and left all the coal units in place. But we did look at different scenarios addressing the assumptions around that baseload generation to look at whether it looks more like nuclear in terms of flexibility or looks more like coal in terms of flexibility. And for the base case, our flow limits are defined by the URGIS subregions. We have no hurdle rates between the regions, so we assume a very efficient flow of electricity throughout the Eastern Interconnection. We assume variable generation, wind and solar PV can provide reserves if it's curtailing, and we also assume reserve methodology from URGIS. We did, in addition to this base scenario, look at other questions about how these conditions might change with different assumptions. So we looked at that higher VG penetration scenario. We also looked at a scenario that did have hurdle rates, and hurdle rates would represent, wheeling charges or any friction that might occur based on the exchange of power between two regions. As I mentioned a second ago, we looked at a scenario where the base load was less flexible, assuming that about a fourth of the base load generation had zero flexibility whatsoever and imitated nuclear units in today's world. And we also looked at a scenario where there's a local conventional generation limit and that 25% of all regional load must be served by local local synchronous machines, so thermal or hydro resource. So those questions kind of bounded our analysis in terms of, what if we don't have this amount of flexibility going forward. I also wanted to give a shout out to the implementation that Josh Novacek implemented for this, and I forgot to acknowledge him, I think, in my title slide, but Josh has done a lot of the work in terms of the modeling and implementation for this study, so thanks, Josh. So this is the geographic decomposition of the model, and it's what allows us to do two things. One, keep the problem a little more computationally tractable and potentially be able to address even bigger questions in the future. And two, potentially represent the way flows are scheduled between regions a little more representative of what really happens in the real world. So it's a three-step process. Step one is a transmission flow forecast. It's a very simplified commitment and dispatch of the Eastern Interconnection, and the only thing that we save from that simplified run is the flow between regions. Number two is the day-ahead decomposed unit commitment. Basically, we take the problem apart into its regions, solve that problem with the day-ahead unit commitment, and then step down into step three, which is the real-time dispatch. So again, it saves us some time and also potentially represents reality a little bit better. Some summary results of what we're looking at here. The system did balance, and I think we served more than 99.9% of all reserves. There was one situation in Florida during the inflexible baseload case where we saw a little bit of load dropped, but that was based on the day-ahead, large day-ahead forecast error that translated through to the real time as lost load, but in reality would have been caught by any intraday decision making. So one of our take-home messages here is going to be that you don't want to run your system based only on day-ahead and real-time dispatch. You want to be making some decisions in the intraday time frame, and we'd like to look at that more in the future. And when we did implement more like an intraday forecast for that day, all of the lost load went away. So that's more of a modeling artifact than reality. But so we did serve a vast majority of the reserves and all the load. In terms of curtailment, in the U.S. Eastern Interconnection, curtailment ranged from 7 to 14% in the scenarios. As you can see in the table on the bottom right, the base scenario had the lowest curtailment. And then as we introduced more flexibility challenges to the system, the curtailment stepped up to the maximum in the local conventional case, which was close to 14%. You can also see the dispatch of the generators, annual dispatch in terms of generation, on the slide on the top and the difference in the picture on the bottom. And you'll see that as that additional curtailment creeps in those scenarios with flexibility challenges, you see obviously less wind and solar dispatch and more dispatch of both the base load and the gas CC and in some cases the peaker gas combustion turbines. This is a quick look at the regional generation in the different scenarios. You can see that some regions, such as SPP and MISO, are major exporters. Other regions, including CERC and to a lesser extent Florida, FRCC, are importers. And the one scenario that changes this a little bit is the hurdle rate scenario, where we, as expected, see significantly fewer flows between the regions. And so the regions that export a lot export less, and the regions that import a lot import a little bit less. Another conclusion here is that less flexible scenarios, these flexibility challenges, cause the system to cost billions of dollars more to operate per year. So you can see the difference in total cost of the different scenarios. While the flexibility challenges, including the inflexible baseload, the local conventional rule, and the hurdle rate scenarios, while they do show a little bit of a reduction in start and shutdown costs because we're not starting up and we're not shutting down our units as often, that cost is overwhelmed by the additional fuel cost, which is caused primarily by that extra curtailment in those scenarios. One thing we set out to address in this study is to look at some of the metrics around system stress. And system stress is a challenging thing to define, but what we kind of looked at here was two different definitions of stress. One would be economic stress, which would be basically the VG curtailment, which causes you to not generate from your wind or solar generation, and therefore you have to cover that with thermal-based generation that costs money to operate. The other is operational stress, and some of the key metrics we were looking at is the headroom that's available, or the difference between the capacity and the generation level at different plants throughout the system, the penetration of non-synchronous generation, so this would include the inverter-based wind and PV generation. There's questions about inertia and voltage stability can be informed by looking at this non-synchronous penetration, and also the starts and usage of your CT generation. So this is a snapshot of, or not, I'm sorry, not a snapshot, but a look at the annual VG curtailment. So it's a duration curve of the year, and you can see that for more than half of the year, more than 4,000 hours of the year, that would be the right side of this plot, you see very little VG curtailment. But as you get to the left side of the plot, you have, potentially 1,000 hours with dozens, 50 plus, 100 plus gigawatts of curtailment, which, relatively speaking, translates to less than the 7 to 14% curtailment in these different scenarios. But you do have certain hours that have very high levels of curtailment, and that's defined as much by the assumptions about flexibility as it is by the actual VG penetration, as you get to a limit in terms of how much VG you can handle based on your load and your required generation. This slide shows the VG curtailment both diurnally on the top right and throughout the season, throughout the year in terms of the months. What you can see is that curtailment is at its minimum in the summer and also in the overnight hours, as you can see a strong solar profile to the curtailment in the figure on the right there. So both of these things suggest that additional storage, both diurnal storage and seasonal storage, could potentially be helpful to mitigate some of this. So to transition into the sort of more system stress related metrics, this is a look at what the VG curtailment for every hour of the year in the different scenarios, and on the y-axis is the actual curtailment that came through in the real time, and on the x-axis is the scheduled curtailment. So how much, basically the question we're looking at here is what percentage of that curtailment was unexpected in the day ahead? So what was a surprise for the system operator? And anything that falls along the red line is exactly what was expected, and anything that's above the red line is more than what was expected. And so that's also described in the numbers in the table there, and you're seeing approximately a third of the curtailment was unexpected from the day ahead. So we're curtailing more than we thought we were for a third of the VG curtailment. This next slide looks at the headroom. This is the headroom of this is undispatched online thermal capacity or curtailed VG that can provide headroom for an increase or an unexpected increase in the load or the net load. And what you see here is that, by region, you can look at the different amounts of headroom. Some of this is defined by the reserve requirements, which require that a certain percentage of the generation be online. And so that's where we see some of this, the headroom kind of limiting out. If you look Eastern Interconnection wide, the amount of headroom never goes below about 7 or 8%, but regionally it can go a little bit lower than that. And one interesting thing that we found here is that scenarios with less flexible operation of the thermal fleet do not protect the system against low headroom conditions. So you see similar low headroom conditions in all of the different scenarios, including the local convention scenario. Next, we looked at the non-synchronous penetration levels, so it's the same duration curve by region, and we looked at these non-synchronous penetration levels, and we found that the less flexible scenarios actually do have some impact on the non-synchronous penetration levels, on the maximum non-synchronous penetration levels. And in some ways this is defined in the local conventional scenario. You can never go above 75% penetration because that was the constraint that we put in. But even the inflexible baseload and the hurdle rate scenario do protect some in some regions against these types of conditions. Again, inertial questions not considered here, but this is just a metric to take a look at it. This next slide is the usage of quick-start combustion turbines. You can see here in the different scenarios that the usage of these resources is pretty similar between the scenarios and also has a very strong diurnal shape to it in all of the different regions, starting some of that generation as the load picks up in the morning before the solar generation picks up, and also in the evening, especially when the solar generation falls off and the load is still there. And this plot, interestingly, looks at the scheduled quick-start generation. So we looked earlier and we found that the day-ahead model predicted the VG curtailment rather well, but it did not predict the need for quick-start generation capacity to be online very well. So this shows on the y-axis quick-start CT generation, and on the x-axis that scheduled generation. So a lot of these quick-start gigawatt hours are from time periods that it was not expected in the day ahead. So this is another strong indicator that using some kind of intraday decision making could be very important in a future scenario with high penetration. So this last slide looks at some of the conclusions, and I've already basically stated all these, and we're running a little tight on time, and so I think I'll leave it at that. Put these up here, and I think we're ready for questions. Is that right, Aaron?
Yeah, that's right.
These slides will be available.
That's right. These slides will be available from UVig, so we'll make sure that people can get access to them. We've got a couple great questions queued up here. We'll go through those. I've got a couple in my back pocket that we can ask, and if people have questions, well, just drop them in the box. Okay, so let's go with this question from Tom Acker again. Hey, Tom asked about the large-scale utilization of electric vehicles and how EV adoption in combination with smart charging might fundamentally change the character of the net load. Jenny, did you consider any of that, or have you thought about any of that in previous work?
Yeah, we actually, so not specifically in the work we did related to wind integration, but we did consider large-scale adoption of electric vehicles in our California 2030 low-carbon grid study. So in that case, we looked at EVs being sort of a really helpful tool in integrating solar energy. So basically what we found is that EVs that charge during the day could really help absorb some of the excess solar energy in California. So that could look differently for pairing with wind or in other renewable scenarios, and the devil is in the details. So you might need to design smart time of use structures or be available for utility controlled charging or that kind of thing. So implementation is challenging, but EVs could be a real resource for helping integration, or they could also be another challenge.
Yeah, and I think we've got two other studies that we're working on right now. They're going to look at electric vehicles in detail. The first one is run by TrueMai out of NREL and is called the Electrification Future Study, where we look at large-scale load growth in the United States, but decreased carbon in the United States at the same time. And we've also got a new study that we're launching with the City of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power that's also going to look at electrification of large portions of the transportation infrastructure. So great question, Tom. David Jacobson out of Manitoba, here's his question for us. I think this one's for Jenny. Is there any pumped hydro in the Pacific Northwest? Can you use this to increase the capacity factor of the north-south DC ties? Anybody know if we have any pumped hydro up in there?
I think there's some, but not much.
Yeah, mostly in California.
I think, you know, it'd be interesting to ask that question also in terms of, in addition to pumped hydro, in terms of the existing hydro fleet and how it could be operated more flexibly to take advantage of some of those north-south ties a little bit better. But they have a lot of constraints that they deal with up there in terms of fish, agriculture usage, recreational usage, things like that, which is probably why David asked about pumped hydro as opposed to the overall hydro.
Great. Great question coming out of the MISO from Mary. What are the assumptions for load, wind, and solar forecasts? And I think she's talking about our operational modeling. Greg and Jenny, either one of you can take this because I think the answer is the same for relatively both of your work. Tell us about operational forecasts for load, solar, and wind.
Want me to take that one?
Sure.
I'll take that one. Okay, so yeah, these operational forecasts are a key question in terms of the ability to operate at high penetrations. So we get our operational forecasts for most of these studies from a numerical weather prediction model that was run both to create the modeled actual wind resource by 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer grid cell in the U.S. And then basically for these runs, the model was run again with different initial conditions based on day-ahead forecasts to try to produce a reasonable day-ahead forecast estimate of the generation level, the wind resource, and therefore the generation level at the different locations where wind is installed. So we try to represent that day-ahead forecast representatively based on state-of-the-art forecasts from today. And so we do all of our day-ahead unit commitment with those forecasts, and then for our real-time analysis, we use the actual. For a lot of our Western work, we include a intraday unit commitment, and I think we'll likely, based on some of the take-home messages from Josh's work with the Renewable Electricity Future Study, we'll likely transition to that for some of our Eastern work also. So we find the forecast to be very important in terms of potential challenges.
Greg, I got another question for you from Drake, and then I'm going to ask a question of everybody on the panel. He noted that you mentioned something about seasonal storage, and really kind of the only resource he thought of that can provide seasonal storage would be hydrogen generation from excess renewables. What else might be considered seasonal storage?
Yeah, so there's definitely, it's a challenge to get to seasonal storage, and you're not talking about battery generation potentially. But, you know, some potential ways to get to seasonal storage would be hydrogen, also power to gas and packing natural gas lines could be a way to get at seasonal storage. But also there is, across North America, there is some seasonal storage available at big conventional hydro generators. And depending on how many constraints exist in the system, some of those big reservoirs could be potentially used for seasonal storage. One particularly interesting one is the Hydro-Quebec resource, and they have about 176 terawatt hours worth of water sitting, potentially able to sit behind their dams, which is an entire year of load in Hydro-Quebec. And so it'd be interesting if we can look at scenarios where transmission can help use that big resource to tap into some of this. And I think Jennie might have some thoughts on this.
Did you have a question you were going to answer, Jennie?
Oh, yes, I had a different question that I already answered in the chat box, but I was just going to reiterate over the phone. So this question was from Drake related to any analysis comparing the cost of curtailment versus the cost of transmission to reduce the curtailment. And I just wanted to let him know that we did perform some of this type of analysis on our, in previous analysis, I included a link to the report in the chat box. But basically we used estimated costs for the transmission projects and found that the simple payback of our first transmission build-out that I was discussing was around 5 years or so. And there are a lot of caveats that surround that. One caveat is that we were using reported costs for those transmission projects, which could be optimistic, and also didn't consider the initial capital cost of building all that wind in the first place. So again, even though these transmission projects might seem like they make a ton of sense, there's a lot of other things to consider.
Great. Wesley, I got a question for you. Thank you for that one, Jennie. Here you go, Wesley. Did your higher growth scenarios take into account the increased renewable curtailments that would reduce their capacity factors and thereby drive up the average costs, making them less attractive? How does REACH handle that problem?
No, it's an important question to ask, because if it's not handled correctly, you will overestimate renewable energy deployment. So yeah, we're taking into account that you have curtailment that's going to reduce your average utilization, also taking into account things like, well, you're shifting your peak load or net peak load hours probably to the evening or nighttime hours, where solar is not going to be able to offset any of that peak capacity anymore. So we're taking those things into account. The other pieces, though, that are competing with this is, in many scenarios, rising natural gas prices that make these technologies more attractive, also declining costs over time. So you have, in essence, renewable energy costs coming down over time, but the renewable energy value also coming down over time, and so it's really the intersection of those two things that really drive the renewable energy deployment.
And to follow up on that, you guys use hourly information to look at your variability calculations for curtailment and for capacity value. Is that right?
That's right. And just, I mean, it's hard to be able to capture all of the pieces without really getting down into the details of what's going on.
Great. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so if people have a few more questions, let's hear them. I've got a couple questions for you guys. What are you doing next? Jenny, can you tell us about what you've got for your next project in the pipe?
Sure. Well, first of all, the results that I presented today will be written up and submitted to peer-reviewed journals, so that's another big hurdle to overcome. But also I have been continuing work on projects looking at the value of concentrated solar power with thermal storage. Specifically, we're going to be looking at CSP's potential to provide more value in the future by providing primary frequency response in this next fiscal year.
Oh, great. Hey, Wesley, what do you got on tap?
Yeah, so one of the things that's extremely interesting to us is storage and its potential, and in these long-term planning models, we've spent so much time focusing on renewables, we're not as good at storage. And so that's not just our model, it's across the board, so we're working with EIA, with EPA, with EPRI to develop methods for improving the representation of storage in these long-term planning models. That's what we're really excited about.
So a couple of things that Aaron, you and I are doing together, and the whole team as part of the Grid Modernization Initiative for the United States Department of Energy is the Interconnection Scene Study, which looks at a lot of these detailed questions and tries to deploy some of these detailed methods to understand the potential benefits of tying the eastern and western interconnections together with various different transmission scenarios. So some might include small lines to tie close regions together, and some might include a bigger grid, a bigger macro grid that would tie different regions of the U.S. together. And beyond that, we're also looking at the North American Renewable Integration Study, which in addition to studying Canada and Mexico in full detail with a lot of these same methods and a lot of these same data sets, and also expanding our data sets, we'll also address questions about the value of, in addition to a lot of these questions that we're asking here, we'll look at the robustness of these scenarios. We'll be looking at 7 years worth of 5-minute resolution wind and solar data, and also addressing questions about the benefits of cross-border cooperation and cross-border transmission.
Great. We had a follow-up question from Mary at MISO. She said you mentioned a lot about the wind forecast, but you didn't say much about the solar forecast. Do they get relatively the same treatment as wind forecasts?
Yes, sorry about that. They get relatively the same treatment, although we are working particularly hard on updating our treatment of the solar forecast because a lot of the solar forecasts that were done for the Eastern Renewable Generation Integration Study and the Western Wind and Solar Integration Study are the ones we're currently using. Those are based on the numerical weather prediction methodology that I was just discussing, but those were done at a time when solar forecasts were in their infancy. So, you know, back in 2009, 2010, nobody was really running with solar forecasts in operation. And so, so we're trying to refine that right now and apply it to our 7-year data set so that the public and we can use that in all of our analysis.
Right, and so if people want to be looking at our wind data or our solar data, they can go online, they can Google Wind Toolkit, and that'll bring them to a resource, a tool called the Wind Prospector, where they can figure out how to download their own wind data sets, including both actual outputs for our simulated data sets and forecasts. You can also go search for the National Solar Radiation Database, NSRDB, and you can download solar power profiles. So I'm not sure if those have the forecast uploaded on them yet. No, Josh is in the room shaking his head.
Working very hard on that right now.
Okay, sounds good. So we're still working on getting those solar forecasts deployed out to the public, but we are using them internally in a variety of different ways. We've got 1 minute left on the call. Oh, Drake, you got another one in there. ERCOT has demonstrated that curtailed renewables are capable of providing significant frequency response. In the 2050 case, how many hours have curtailed renewables in them? So what was your annual curtailment? Only 7 to 10% on an annual energy basis, but surely higher for some percentages of the hours.
Yeah, so this right here is the duration curve, and you can see we have this regionally also in the report that we'll be publishing in the next, not before Christmas, but hopefully soon after. But so you can see that, you know, for close to half the year, close to half of the hours of the year, we have curtailment somewhere in the Eastern Interconnection. We would expect to see pretty similar numbers for the Western Interconnection, but regionally these numbers might differ a little bit, and you might see a little bit less than half of the time. In this scenario, we did allow VG to provide reserves, but we have modeled scenarios in the past where we don't, and when we do both, we find that it is valuable for VG to provide reserves, especially at these levels of high penetration.
Great. Well, thanks for getting that last question answered there. We've got to wrap it up for now. We're running just a little bit over, but I want to put a final plug for the spring workshop of UVIG that's happening in Tucson, Arizona, March 13th through 15th. We've got a great agenda for you already starting to come together. We're going to have the final results from the STEAM study there. We're going to have a bunch of other presentations that come from other members of UVIG, and we're even going to probably add an event on advanced computational methods for production cost models at the very end of the week. So lots to look forward to. You can reach out to myself, Aaron Bloom, aaron.bloom@nrel.gov if you have any questions for any of the other panelists. Of course, you can write Charlie or Ryan Willis if you have more. And thank you so much for your questions, and we'll catch up with you in March. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.